I can't tell you how much fun it is for me as a dyed-in-the-wool innkeeper to be doing this tonight, but especially with you. And so welcome. I've got a couple of things I need to say, obviously. If you go back in time, there was this thing called the Clean Waters Act, and it cleaned up the rivers of the country, including the White River. And as kids, where I used to paddle around and fool around with my good friend Bill Toomey, who's here tonight. We go back to age 2. And another good friend from the same neighborhood, Nina Ballard. By the way, there's a picture of me and Nina in the bathtub. And when I told her husband it was 1964, he got a little nervous, but it was like 1949 maybe. But the Clean Water Act cleaned up the rivers in America eventually, but it was slow in catching on. And in the 37 years now that I've been an innkeeper and taking people visiting the Hotel Coolidge out on the White River, my brother, who's 12 years younger but living in the Midwest, caught up to that, and he said, are you kidding me? You're taking people to the White River? And I said, not only do I take them there, I charge them for it. And why would I think about that tonight? Because you're all here and you paid to hear me talk for an hour. So there's a little of P.T. Barnum in every good innkeeper. Speaking of lifelong friends, I have a very dear friend in the form of my Norwich University classmate Bob Potter. And Bob over here has been a significant factor in Hartford High School education, teaching Hartford kids history, predominantly on a course that he made into a legendary course called Hitler and the Holocaust. And he would bring kids here to see these murals and prop me up as an educator to talk to them. And so that's another link. Bob is also a significant person in terms of impact on community and what the educators mean to a community. Back to my friend Bill here and myself, we played sports all through high school. In our senior year in football, we had a perfect season. We lost them all. And we had been known as, you won't believe this in the world of political correctness, but Hartford High teams were invigorated by the spirit of a high-speed bunch of Italians from the South End who rose to national prominence as a basketball team in the 1920s. Went to a national tournament and all that, and the sports writers dubbed them the Hartford Midgets. And so we showed up on the field every day and played against Bob's team from Pulteney, who pounded us, as the Hartford Midgets. And after that perfect season, the coach was so ripped that he renamed the team the Hartford Hurricanes. And since then, they've been a dynasty. And you think, with the power of words, the power of speech, which is part of what I'm going to talk to you about tonight. Bob brought this thing to Hartford, though, following closely on that change, a whole new attitude for the kids in this town to take towards sports and team play and work ethic. And he made it possible for the kids in this town to all get out on the same playing field. There was a whole ethos change. And he and a memorable math teacher by the name of Bob Taylor really instilled in the kids of Hartford how to work together. Just can't say enough about that. And so the concept of working together is going to flare up here as we go through this story tonight. So, sorry to put you on the spot, Bob, but you're... No. In fact, one of the ground rules is we're going to do a Q&A at the end, but you can't talk between now and then because Chico here is going to record this for CATV. And we can go off on all the wild goose chases you want at the end, and I will welcome that. Before I begin, a couple of shout outs to Nancy. When Nancy comes back in, give her a round. She really deserves it. And to Chico for showing up from CATV. Chico is an anchor in terms of the blooming arts community here in White River. Works at CATV, but he shows up for everything that Sherry and I do in the Briggs Opera House these days. He's such a support. And of course, Peggy. I can't do anything without Peggy. So when Nancy comes back, interrupt me, we'll give her a little round of applause. So I want to tell you the story of the Vermont Room murals. There's no good seat in the house tonight. You're going to have to follow the bouncing ball. And I have a handout. Always a handout. But this one has been made simple. Bob, you want to hand these out, please? I love handing off to a quarterback. Here, Nina, this is for you. So the background of the Vermont Room murals has to do with my predecessor, whose name was August L. Zollikofer. And Zollikofer was a Swiss-born person who became an engineer and ended up in Philadelphia, and finally, eventually arrived here in White River Junction in 1946, which means he and I arrived in White River the same year. He was a little more competent than me at that point. And he turned himself into a restaurateur hotelier, which sounds familiar because that's eventually what I did some 50 years later. Zollikofer was made popular by virtue of his cuisine, which was Northern Italian cuisine featuring various cuts and variations of veal, Northern Italian. And that caught the attention of the Dartmouth faculty. And the Dartmouth faculty was used to the usual provincial fare or the tourist fare, which was typically spaghetti and meatballs and chicken in a basket if you go back to the 1950s. And so he's very popular and very likable, and he had a decent following from that. So he shows up on your sheet as one of the four men of the Vermont Room murals, August L. Zollikofer. Today, because of this significant work that came about on his watch, the gallery that Peggy runs in the lobby is known as the Zollikofer Gallery. And we do that intentionally to keep these names present and remembered and respected. So August L. Zollikofer. And you'll hear much more about him as we go forward. Now, one of those Dartmouth faculty members was at the time, the Dartmouth artist in residence. He followed the famous Orozco, and hopefully you've all seen the Orozco murals in the basement of Baker Library. And his name was Paul Sample. Paul Sample had graduated Dartmouth in the early 1920s, and he went out and made a name for himself. He was a WPA era artist, among other things, during the Roosevelt years. And so what you see here on these walls is somewhat reflective of the WPA era mood, the public works art. Got some more handouts here. Now, Paul Sample, as a patron of Zollikofer, heard about the notion that this room is a three-season porch, and the artist, Mike Gish, told me just yesterday, reminded me that this room had 17 windows in it. And it was transformed into this banquet room to accommodate these murals. But you've all seen these famous images of Sample. This is a retrospective of his work. And he has sort of a Grandma Moses innocence to him, but it's a little bit sharper and reflective of his travels around the country before he came home to Dartmouth. Don't steal that, okay? It's out of print. And if you wonder about how prominent he was, here's a copy of Life magazine. And this goes back to be the 10th anniversary issue of Life. My sister gave me this as a provocation. It was sort of like, came out about the same time that I was born. She says, here, this thing is as old as you are. And that's what sisters were put on earth to do, right? And the interesting part was this is the 10th anniversary issue of Life. So it has a lot of retrospective and special stuff in it. And by the way, I've given this talk many times to numerous Rhodes Scholar groups here, and on one occasion a Rhodes Scholar attendee said, yes, she says, I have that issue, and she said, if you look closely, you'll see this little girl is reading the first issue of Life magazine. So it turns out to be a real treasure. And if you go through it, there are various features, and one of the features in it are American artists of the time, people like Thomas Hart Benton, Andrew Wyeth, Grant Wood, and Paul Sample makes the cut. So he's that big, Paul Sample. I get a kick out of the back page here. It says, reminds us that more doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarettes. So what was to be a story about the Coolidge mystique, according to Zollicoffer, gets the ear of Sample and one of his Dartmouth faculty colleagues, a philosophy and religion professor by the name of Eugen Rosenstock Hussey. Quite a handle, right? It's hyphenated. Eugen Rosenstock Hussey. He was born Rosenstock in 1888. Make note of this because it will come back to it. He was born a Jew but became a Christian after World War I. And he found his way to Harvard, leaving Germany in 1934, being tuned in and smart enough to realize what was happening with the Nazi message. And he was at Harvard for a little over a year when he came to Dartmouth and spent the rest of his career here. And he was educated as a lawyer, but was in the religion and philosophy department here at Dartmouth. Now, I don't know what you want to make of that. My good lawyer friend George Wenz is here. We can talk about that ad infinitum after tonight. But Hussey was a very significant person, as you will hopefully see, and he called Zollicoffer on the carpet for wanting to pull something around the Coolidge mystique together. He said, that smacks of crass commercialism. You've got to do something more significant. And of course, the question was, well, what would you recommend? And Sample and Hussey came back with the answer to be introduced to one of their rising star students, who was Peter Michael Gish. At the time, Gish was a senior at Dartmouth, and he was enlisted to do this work in trade for a small stipend of about $1,000, and it took him 6 months, during which time he also got his room and board. Peter Michael Gish. I have another handout on him. This is an older magazine now. It's 1993. It's the Greenwich magazine, and it features Gish as, at the time, a faculty member at Fairfield University. But there's much more to Gish than that. He was then commissioned by the Marine Corps. Here's a picture of him. He's now 95. I spoke to him this morning. And he's still very active, as Peggy will tell you. His studio is full of work that he's still working on. He's almost as fit as you see here. And why would he appear this fit? Well, he's a most unique person. He is a Marine Corps aviator and a full colonel, in addition to being an educator and a lifelong artist. Mike Gish flew in both Korea and Vietnam, and then was commissioned by the Marine Corps to do combat art in places like Iraq, Vietnam, and Somalia. Peter Michael Gish. He's the Dartmouth class of 1949, and he did this work following graduation, and so it's dated. His signature is over there next to the entrance door, 1950. Wonderful person. Now, I had only heard vaguely about Gish as a youngster. I walked by these murals 100 times, never cared about them. And on one moment where I was in this room by myself, sweeping up after what was probably a Dartmouth fraternity party, the door swung open, and I thought it was an apparition because I thought the artist couldn't possibly be still alive, and yet he walked through the door. And I figured he had to be ancient. Well, he was ancient. He was well into his 60s. And now that I'm 74, that's a pretty laughable matter. At any rate, Gish was given the commission to do this work, and it's not the Coolidge mystique, it's the Story of Vermont. It's over 80 feet in length and culminates with this barn dance scene, which is in the other room in the cafe, and you can see that on the way out tonight, if you'd like to do that. It starts in this corner, and that's why I say there are no good seats in the house. You're just going to have to be agile and nimble and cooperative. And it's a chronological piece, and I'll tell you things that he's representing and see how it weaves together. The Story of Vermont. It's a piece done in oil on canvas that's literally stuck to plywood panels, and then it has a varnish covering over it. So anything you see that looks a little bit like rainfall and other things that we've allowed to happen to it have not injured the work. It just needs to be gently cleaned. So icons and memories and representations of Vermont are abound in the piece. The first symbol here, of course, is Mount Ascutney. And for those of you who haven't heard this before, the Abenaki refer to Mount Ascutney as a monadnock, which is to say a mountain that rises with no foothills. And it pops up, as you know, over 3,000 feet, which is good even by Colorado standards. The Connecticut River is prominent here because that's the way the white English settlers get to Vermont. Just after the French and Indian Wars, the English technique for controlling the land is to make sure that they populated it with settlers, and up the river they came. And I can say this on the basis of primary sources because my 8th great grandmother made that trip from Hebron, Connecticut, and landed as the third family in Thetford, Vermont. Now, just to give you a little insight as to how wonderfully thoughtful Gish is and was at the time, even as a 23-year-old, if you look into the heavens there, you see what looks like a ghost. Well, that's an Iroquois Indian mask. And that's Gish's nod to who came first. At a time when there was no Native American Studies program or any heightened sensitivity, it was just his goodness that thought, we ought to get this right. And so he moves on to chronicling the pioneer struggle. So you see the men here clearing the land, building rudimentary shelter, in this case a log cabin, of course. And if you look carefully around the room as we go, the buildings get ever more sophisticated. There's real people involved in this. And this is the outrun of Hussey's influence as the philosophy professor, mentor, guide. Gish actually was influenced more by Hussey, arguably, than he was by Paul Sample. If you see the fellow swinging the axe there, he's a real person. His name is Bob O'Brien. And if you think about it, you've heard the name O'Brien in these parts. A few years ago, there was a wonderful movie that was brought out called Man with a Plan. It's a story of this hypothetical, hilarious Vermont farmer named Fred Tuttle, who's a real person. And Fred Tuttle comes from Tunbridge. And Bob O'Brien found his way to Tunbridge, not out of Dartmouth, but during Dartmouth, because Vermont was so seriously depressed in the hills around the Upper Valley, it was like Appalachia, that they went there as volunteers, and they got excited about the impact they could make. Bob O'Brien was so excited about that he bought a farm. And you say, well, how could a college student buy a farm? Well, in 1939, a 250-acre hill farm in Tunbridge, Vermont cost $600. And Bob made that commitment after World War II when he came back, and eventually, soon after, decided to raise his family here. One of his children turns out to be John O'Brien. And John O'Brien's the filmmaker who made the movie Man with a Plan. Now, why would he do that? Well, Hussey, let's go back to Hussey, the professor. His notion was as a speech thinker. He said in many different ways, Descartes was wrong. It's not I think, therefore I am, it's I speak, therefore I am. And he points out that humans are unique insofar as they can speak and reason, and no other animal can really quite do that. And so he brought that to his students. They got very excited, and they said, well, what can we do about this? And he said, well, one of the things you might consider doing is making a difference in your community. You're so terribly privileged compared to these hill farmers in Tunbridge that here's an idea. And this is what Hussey brought to them. He said, there's a movement in America called the CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps. And he said, there are similar activities in Germany. He said, the German model is actually better than the American model because in America they take people from the same stripe of society and they put them in an isolated position. He said, if you privileged Dartmouth boys would think about it, you could join in with the CCC and they would learn from you and you would learn from them. A mutual benefit. So they got very excited about that. Some of Hussey's Harvard students, most notably a fellow by the name of Frank Davidson, got very excited, and they decided to petition the CCC for an experimental camp. And they were working off what this fellow named Frank Davidson had experienced and Hussey brought to the Dartmouth students from the great philosopher at Harvard named William James. And James had presented this notable essay at Stanford University in 1908, mind you, almost 6 or 7 years before the start of World War I. And in it he said, we are all endowed with this fabulous willingness to put the ultimate sacrifice out there, but we do it in times of war. He said, life on earth is a life and death experience. He said, don't live it in the abstract, it's real. You've got to really feel it, you got to touch it, you got to experience it. And they said, well, how do we deal with this? He said, well, you might consider forming this special camp in a place that you have some heartfelt interest, which turned out to be Tunbridge, Vermont. So they had the notion of creating a camp, and they went to the CCC bureaucracy, and it was immediately turned down. You might know. Well, they didn't count on the fact that Frank Davidson, the young Harvard student, was well connected. And Frank's father was a lawyer in New York City who, among other things, helped elect Mayor LaGuardia, for example. And as the summer tumbled on, when it came to Labor Day weekend, with all the excitement these young fellows had for doing something notable, Frank and his parents were invited to Hyde Park on the Hudson. And Frank had the unique moment in time to have a one-on-one discussion with the unforgettable Eleanor Roosevelt. And he complained to her about the bureaucracy and explained about their excitement. And as a result of that cocktail party talk, the camp was approved. And rightfully, the boys named it Camp William James. It's a real happening, as you can see by evidence by this book, that one of the campers put into print 30 years later, Frank Davidson. And among those people was a person that some of you have heard of and knew, was Clint Gardner, who would have been the class of 1944, and Bob O'Brien, among others, and Frank Davidson. So as we move along, the artist makes us realize that Vermont is a four-season state. He shows the pioneer struggle, pulling things through the snow here. He puts icons of Vermont in the work, and so over the kitchen door is Camel's Hump. As you tumble into the corner, you see the pioneer couple, and that's a self-portrait of Mike Gish, the young artist, and his lady friend at the time. Her name was Elsie. Elsie lived the rest of her life here in the Upper Valley. She just passed away this last year. And as I told you, Mike Gish now lives in Saunderstown, Rhode Island, just past 95 years old, and still very active. In the corner is a salute to Mount Mansfield. And then we come to a rather interesting scenario. Can anyone tell me what they think is going on in this scenario here? If you look carefully here, you see a woman here in some strife, and you see this little bundle of joy here, and the husband. This is childbirthing, pioneer style, at home without a doctor present. You see the midwife and the woman in labor. Now, when I was telling this story, one woman piped up looking at the husband, and she said, "What's his problem?" And of course, he's totally amazed, because childbirth pioneer style was a high-risk proposition, and it's apparent that his wife has survived. Up above that, you see what looks like a rocket ship, and that's hardly a rocket ship. It's the reference to the Bennington Battle Monument, 300-foot high stone obelisk that represents Vermont's moments in the early stages of the Revolutionary War. Vermonters are proud of this because The British came down from Montreal, Burgoyne on his way to Saratoga. He makes it to Saratoga, but when he gets there, he's tired and out of ammunition, partly because of the resistance on Lake Champlain at Hubbardton, and eventually losing the Battle of Bennington. There's a great irony about the Battle of Bennington, and that has to do with the fact that when they finally drew the line that determined and defined Vermont versus New York, the battleground's actually in what we call New York today. But the municipality and the ammunition dump was in Bennington as we know it. The Green Mountain Boys were not led by Ethan Allen. They were led by a New Hampshire man, John Stark. So lots of ironies about the twists of history and the real things that happened. When the trip started, they were beleaguered on Lake Champlain and hoodwinked by an American patriot. Anyone want to guess who that was? The person that stepped in Burgoyne's way on the lake? Benedict Arnold, right. He shows up at Saratoga where he's also a hero, but today if you go to Saratoga, you'll see monuments to the 4 generals, only the one that would be Benedict Arnold's is not there for obvious reasons. Now, everyone has a theory on what happened to Arnold. I think the most succinct explanation I heard to it was that he listened to his wife. You can take that however you like. Okay, the next scene goes from log cabin to post and beam, barn raising scenario here. And again, real people are used. You see the fellow here? Gish had a good sense of economy because he used the same model for all 4 guys there. This fellow's name was Elwyn Phillips, and he was the partner of my father, where they together had a gas station across the street from here on a location that today is called Fred Briggs Park, and they were partners for the better part of 15 years. The artist is quick to point out to me that this is Elwyn Phillips, but the bicep belongs to Bob O'Brien. So that's why you came tonight, was to hear stuff you'd never know, right? Up over the door, of course, is the reference to Lake Champlain, Vermont's Great Lake. And we all know that it has its own monster. It's a beauty. It's 140 miles long, and it's the thoroughfare from Montreal to New York City with the help of a little canal around Whitehall and Fort Edward. For those of you who don't believe in Champ, I need to point out that there is a credible picture of Champ, and made credible by the fact that it's pretty clearly a monster, and it was taken by some guy's 11-year-old granddaughter, and of course we know that 11-year-old granddaughters tell the truth. Lake Champlain. We finally get to the finished Vermont village. The quintessential farmer is positioned here. There's no specific name. It's meant to be representative of Vermont hill farmers. And this is an accurate depiction of Plymouth Notch, the birthplace and the childhood residence of Calvin Coolidge. And it looks exactly like this today, thanks to preservation efforts. It's tranquil. It's really a shrine-like place. I encourage you to all go there more than once if you've already been. And these hillsides tell us a lot. And those hillsides still have poplar and birch trees on them. The artist is wonderfully accurate. But there's one thing that's different. These meadows are all gone. And in the time from Gish's work, circa 1950 to now, Vermont has flipped from being 30% open to 70% open. I mean, I got that reversed, the other way. 30% open to 70% forested, yeah, in that time frame. And I might also add that Vermont's population has doubled since then. Stuck at the level of 330,000 or so. Today, post-interstates, you all know that we're about 650,000. The day that Mike Gish came through that door, it was open just like it was a minute ago. And we got into a conversation. He said, "What about the train?" And I said, "What about the train?" As I told you, I had never really stepped back and taken note and made any careful, thoughtful evaluation of the work. the door was typically open and I didn't realize the train was there. Well, very appropriate thing, because after all, the whole White River story is about trains, but the story of Vermont is about trains. The only New England state without seafront was landlocked, and its biggest products were really hard to get to market materials like slate. I'm talking slate there, Bob Potter from Pulteney. Marble and granite and lumber and even dairy products, tough to get to market. So the trains came to Vermont in the 1840s, and of course that was thought to be a panacea. And the irony is that it turned out to facilitate an exodus. So now the artist shows us farms going into disrepair and neglect. As kids hunting in the forests and the hillsides of West Hartford and other places, we would see land like this today. Today it's McMansions. But in the 1950s, this was pretty typically it. Still depressed, and Vermont wondering what its future was going to be. Well, why did this happen? Well, the westward expansion is shown here, represented by the artist as Monument Valley in the southwest. The whole westward expansion, triggered by two major things. One was the California Gold Rush, and the second thing was the American Civil War. And you see the references here to the Civil War soldiers. So this last frame is an overlay, and it starts off with a detailed horse, which of course is his salute to the Morgan. The Morgan horse, compact and elegant enough to be a saddle horse and tough enough to pull a plow. And it fades into this vague representation surrounding war and why we go to war. There's some interesting things about Vermonters at this point in time. The plow, of course, reminds us of a fellow from Middlebury who went to Moline, Illinois, came up with a new plow and made a fortune for himself. His name is John Deere. His eastern Vermont equivalent was a fellow from East Thetford, Vermont, who got into shipping and banking. His name was Henry Wells, and he started what we now know as Wells Fargo. In Pulteney, Vermont, were two young journalists who worked through their apprenticeship and went to New York City. One of them, named George Jones, started his own paper. Today it's called the New York Times. And the other was Horace Greeley, who cast us with Go West, Young Man, and actually was a presidential candidate. So Vermonters had a pretty significant impact on the rest of the country. Fading into the Civil War reference here, the artist was influenced by the works of Picasso, and at the time, a notable piece by Marcel Duchamp called Nude Descending the Staircase. And he used the more abstract, vague horses intentionally, because you see the reference to the Civil War soldier and the broken cannon. It's bringing up that puzzling question of why do we go to war? And the artist at this time in his life was very, very front of mind, because he had two things going on for him. First of all, he was just a hair too young to participate in World War II, the time when it was thought your noble duty to do that, and more doubly so because his brother Jim had been killed in hand-to-hand combat at the Battle of Saipan. This is very fresh and still with him. In fact, it's fresh today. So the question of why do we go to war? What's going on there? So we finally come to the final scene. Before we do that, though, I want to go back to the Coolidge birthplace and tell you a little funny story about Calvin Coolidge. I've been quite captivated by him, and this work has helped bring that alive. And Coolidge, you may know, grew up in that village but never really returned except to visit his father and as a tourist. And he went to Amherst College, got involved in Massachusetts politics, and inched his way all the way up to the governor of Massachusetts, made a name for himself putting down the famous Boston police strike, and becomes Warren Harding's running mate in 1920. And there's a cute story about Coolidge as the lieutenant governor of Massachusetts on his way up. He's the president of the Senate. Now, this may seem strange to you, but a Democrat and a Republican got into a heightened discussion. And the Republican, of all things, Coolidge being a Republican, lost his cool and shouted across the chamber to his Democrat adversary and said, "Go to hell." And the Democrat rose and he said, "Mr. President, might we have a ruling?" And Coolidge said, "You don't have to go." This was pretty typical of Calvin Coolidge. So Coolidge's gravesite is represented right here in the end slide, this rounded headstone. It's impressionistic. If you go there, you'll see 5 or 6 Coolidge stones that are all rounded off like that. And Gish was touched by that cemetery because on the back side of it, it's like the little cemetery out in West Norwich, so popular in the Paul Sample pieces. Gish found an example of Vermonters in the Civil War. Now, Vermont was asked by President Lincoln, he asked Governor Fairbanks to rouse 3 Vermont regiments. That would be about 3,000 men. And before the end of the Civil War, Vermont had sent 33,000 men, 1/10 of the population. So it was a big deal, and Gish found the reference to that on the backside of that cemetery, where out of that little village of Plymouth Notch, a father and son had both gone to the Civil War. The father made it home and the son didn't, and he thought that was doubly poignant for that to have happened. He finishes up here with the faceless character, and this faceless because it's not filling in the answer to the question, what is the moral equivalent of war? Now, in the case of Gish, it's pretty easy to see what he thought of as the moral equivalent of war. As a lifelong artist, he's put his life and his passion into it. As a Marine and an aviator, he flew into dangerous territory and put it all out there. So it's pretty easy to see that. He's following up on the influence that Husey had on him, and being sort of a junior observer of the Camp William James experience. I want to tell you a couple things about Camp William James. It ended with Pearl Harbor, of course, and they all went off to fight. It had a lasting impact that's referenced in the book itself, and most notably on people that came along like Mike Gish after that. It just rides every day with me personally. Once I heard this notion that there might be a moral equivalent of war, I was pretty fired up to be ever more conscious day to day in how you live your life with conscious intent, doing the thing that will bring you the courage that it takes to do the tough work, even if it means great sacrifice. So I stand in awe of these people. Gish rounds it out here very nicely with this barn dance scene, which he painted as sort of a sequel, but really I call it the culmination. And he positioned it in Zollicoffer's new cocktail lounge, which was in one slice of that larger dining room that many of you have been in. On the back wall, one slice of that room was fashioned as a bar that you access by coming down the alley and coming in the side door. And at the far end, he had this barn dance scene in a place where people were supposed to be having a good time and living it up. And his word here to us is that no matter how difficult and doubtful and painful and all of those challenging things are, we still seem to have the energy and the determination to celebrate, kick back, and be together. In this scene, Gish puts people that he knew at the time in play here, and he himself is in the white shirt dancing with the lady in the red dress. The lady in the red dress is the sister of Elsie, and Elsie, his lady friend, has her back to you in a plaid shirt. Elsie's other sister is in a yellow dress, and their brother is in the other white shirt off to the left. The fellow in the corner with a bottle of Ballantine ale sticking out of his pocket is the hotel maintenance guy. And the provocative woman in the front, nobody knows, but everybody wants to. The barn dance. Huntington's Pavilion exists today. It's been restored somewhat as a dance hall. It's right across from Cedar Circle Farm. For years, it was the studio of a guy from Dartmouth in graphics named John Scottford. And my folks, for example, danced their way through Thetford Academy in this little dance hall. So it's kind of fun to go back there and deal with that. So that's the story of the Vermont Room murals, but I want to complete it with a little epilogue here. Can I slide right by you there, Chico? This is a picture of Rosenstock Hussey. As I said, he characterized himself as a speech thinker. He said it's speech that makes us human. Born in 1888, I had the good fortune of being invited to a symposium on his life upon the occasion of what would have been his 100th birthday in 1988, and it was in one of the Dartmouth halls, and I went to the lectures there and met some of the people that were closest to him. Hussey lived on Hobson Road in Norwich, and there's another great story we can all convene again for if you'd like to do that some night, and a video on his eventual life partner, a wonderful woman named Freya von Moltke, who lived, after Hussey's wife passed away, he summoned her from South Africa where she was raising her sons post-World War II, and she's a notable person in World War II, part of the famous Kreisau Circle, the intellectual group that met, convened several times, maybe half a dozen times, to figure out what Germany should do for itself after the inevitable demise of Hitler and the Third Reich. Her husband was caught up in that, and he was executed just painfully 5 months before the end of the war. She was left with 2 sons that she raised in South Africa, and then eventually moved to be with Hussey here in Vermont. There's one other thing I'd like to tell you. Hussey brought about a diagram that he used, and his disciple Clint Gardner related to it often, and I do myself personally. It's called the cross of reality. Now, it doesn't mean the Christian cross. It's really a diagram that happens to be an intersection. And he diagrams it in such a way that at the bottom of this intersection, on one point of what might be the compass, is history. The things that we know and we've experienced as real. And on the right-hand side are all the objective data that we can gather. On the left-hand side is all the subjective notes that we can make to ourselves that incorporate all our biases, our emotions, our passions. And his theory is if you blend those things together, call it prayer or meditation or contemplation or whatever, you generate out of that an imperative which helps you say, this is what I'm going to do. Because the imperative tells you that this is what you must do as a function of those things. So it's a really interesting tool on how to make up your mind on something. So, this is the only picture I have of August Zollikofer. What happened to him? Well, he was the innkeeper restaurateur until 1970. He catered my wedding here in 1968, one of the last things he did. And one of the campers at Camp William James had also bought a farm in South Royalton. And as you were about to see, one of the more unique stories, a fellow by the name of Dan Goldsmith. And tonight, we are really honored and pleased to have the son of Dan Goldsmith here with us, Nick Goldsmith. So say hi to Nick. And now I'm going to tell you a little bit about his dad's story. Zollikofer bought the farm from Dan Goldsmith, and in his just before his retirement years, in fact quite a few years, he moved from White River Junction, where he lived on Maplewood Terrace, out to South Royalton. And Dan didn't come back to being a farmer. He had a better idea for himself. Here he is playing with Dan Goldsmith in that barn dance scene. Now, I'm under the gun because I've never processed this with Nick, and he has got all the license to clarify this when we're done. And maybe I'll even say something that he doesn't know, but we're about to find out. Dan was a camper at Camp William James, but he wasn't a Harvard or a Dartmouth student. He was a Juilliard student. And he had a tough moment in his life where his father died, and the grief hit him particularly hard. And I know that for sure because he told me. And he had come to a couple of receptions that I had thrown here, not knowing really what I was doing. Tonight I'm getting ever closer to knowing what I'm doing, and 35 years later. But after I started to develop the intrigue around this fellow named Dan Goldsmith, I called him up one day, and I had discovered that he was an Episcopalian priest, and he ran as the rector the beautiful little stone church you see near the Killington gondola. You come towards Rutland on Route 4. If you look carefully there by the Killington gondola, you see the beautiful little chapel. It has a wonderful legacy to it, and Dan was the rector there for a good many years. And I called him up that morning, and I knew enough about the story to talk to him about it, and I said, "You got to forgive me, Dan, but Goldsmith doesn't sound like the most Anglican name I've ever heard. What happened?" Well, I learned by putting it together that Husey had had this genuine conversion from Judaism to Christianity as his MO. It seemed natural to him. He had an intellectual counterpart in Germany. They were kind of the wonder boys of intellectual thought and philosophy. The other fellow's name was Franz Rosenzweig, so you might check that out sometime. They were the rising stars in intellectual dialogue. And Husey made the conversion. Rosenzweig couldn't quite do it. And my belief is that when Dan heard from a trusted uncle in his grief that some really interesting stuff was being done up north by a friend who turned out to be Husey, he said, "Why don't you go there?" And so he said, I took the leap of faith, and he got on a train and rumbled into White River Junction. One of the Harvard students picked him up and took him to Camp William James. And this was just a way of breaking up the pattern of his life. And he told me this because when I called him up, he said, "I'm 72 and I've got a lot of wood to split and I've got to tend to business here." Well, one of the things that Husey said in his various works was, if you want to get to know somebody, work with them. Get dirty, get down. And so I said, "Oh, I can handle that." So I showed up there about 6 o'clock one frozen morning, and we chopped wood until his wife, Nadia, Nick's mom, treated us to a wonderful breakfast. It was well worth it just for the breakfast. But along the way, some of these things came out through the cracks, and I realized what Dan had done. He had become an Episcopalian priest out of that whole circumstance. He said, when I got to Tunbridge, he said, I wondered, what have I done? Talk about buyer's remorse, right? And Husey came up to him, put his hand on his shoulder. He says, "You're going to do things here you could never have imagined." He said, "It's that deep." He said, "Within 6 weeks, I was teaching Vermont villagers how to sing Bach chorales. And to this day, Tunbridge has a wonderful choral society." Dan was very instrumental, pun intended, in forming the Vermont Philharmonic. And when I was a band member at the Norwich University, if I'd been this much better, I would have played with him in that unit, but I wasn't chosen. Other of my mates were. But he went on to be the faithful rector of that Episcopalian diocesan retreat out at Killington. And through splitting wood with him, I got to hear some of these stories. I might add, Dan was married to a wonderful woman, and unique in her own way, and she came from out of the Russian Orthodox tradition, and when Dan retired, they relocated to Cambridge, New York, where they were able to live next to a Russian Orthodox monastery for Nadia's benefit. I mentioned Clint Gardner. Now, I picked up on Clint early on because he was really accessible, and he had written a book called Letters to the Third Millennium, all about speech thinking and the cross of reality. And then not too long after that, he came up with this book called D-Day and Beyond. Now, Clint was at Camp William James, left and went to England and found himself in a compound with an 18-foot high fence around it, preparing for a thing called Operation Overlord. We all familiar with that? The D-Day landing, right? Young Army officer on the boats, headed across the channel, went out, came back in that famous rainstorm, and then finally went to find himself on Omaha Beach at 9 o'clock in the morning. Not a good time. A German shell hit him in the head. This is his helmet, which is in the Dartmouth Special Collections. He sat on that beach for about 8 hours, assuming that he was dying, spent a fair amount of his time writing thoughtful notes in his diary. That's the kind of guy he was. And he said when he finally got to the medic tent, he said it took 3 guys to get the helmet off his head because it had been pinched into his scalp. It was a lot of blood, but superficial, and he survived. Clint and I used to meet on D-Day. This was the last time that we met. And on that occasion, we were joined by 2 other notable fellows, a fellow named Dr. Bob Christie, who's a Norwich grad of the same age, who was at the Battle of the Bulge, and a good fellow named Walter Payne, who many of you know was a great fundraiser and influencer in the Upper Valley and caused, among other things, the Montshire Museum to happen. And I served on the board with Walter. And so I invited these 3 men to be together on that D-Day lunch, and I knew what Bob Christie had done, and I knew that what Clint Gardner had done, but I didn't know specifically what Walter had done, except for he was World War II generation. And I said, so Walter, what's your story? He said, I was on the island of Tinian when the Enola Gay left to go drop the bomb on Hiroshima. So notable men conveying all that they had to convey through their speech. Clint Gardner. Clint ended up coming back to America and being somewhat successful with a mail order business that he sold to Harry and David. But before that, before he was even off the continent, 6 months after D-Day, he was back in the field as a forward observer. These are the guys that watch artillery shells land and tell people what's happening. And he was in a group of people that were in a house that was bombed by one of our own B-24s. A tragic mistake. Clint was among the only 3 people that couldn't get out of the house, and the house saved their lives because it collapsed on top of them in a way that saved their life. That was January. June, D-Day, January, Battle of the Bulge, the end of it, with that tragic example. And now comes May, and because of his ability with the German language, he's tapped along with a major to process out what he was told was 20,000 POWs. And it wasn't POWs at all, it was Buchenwald. So he ends up at Buchenwald to witness parts of the Holocaust. As we now know, if you were going to go any place, Buchenwald was the good place to go because all they did was work you to death. But he got to see that. And then, if that wasn't enough, 2 years later, he was tapped to become the editor of the newspaper in Berlin during the Berlin airlift, because one of the Harvard students from Camp William James knew of Clint and enlisted him to come back to Germany and be part of the Berlin airlift. So a notable life, Clint Gardner. His moral equivalent of war was to create an organization called Bridges for Peace. And it was based on the speech thinking philosophy that if the man on the street in the Soviet Union could speak to the man on the street in U.S., there would be hope for reconciliation. Now, this room is studded with people that have notable experience, and Sherry Merrick, who works with me on the Opera House, worked with Clint on Bridges for Peace, and when we're done, hopefully she can tell us about that. Paige Smith, Dartmouth class of 39. Paige Smith was a notable fellow at Camp William James, found himself in Colorado at a place called Camp Hale, where he joined the 10th Mountain Division. That put him in the Italian Alps, climbing Mount Belvedere to make a difference in one of the crucial assaults to get American allies up the boot of Italy and into the rest of Europe. He was a company commander. He was wounded, survived, and eventually came back to America, where he's a noted historian. So much so that when he passed, the New York Times gave him a third of a page. He has this 7-volume set called The People's History of America. He did a notable piece on John Adams way before David McCulloch. And I commend you to his work because it's written in such a human way. Paige Smith. He was at that Rosenstock-Huessy retrospective in Dartmouth in 1988. I'd heard this much about him, and wouldn't you know, I was walking down the street across the Dartmouth Green right behind him. And they said, "Excuse me, are you Paige Smith?" And he said, "Yes," and we had a nice little talk and walk together. What was his moral equivalent of war? He helped found and create the University of California at Santa Cruz and helped form the California Youth Conservation Corps. Paige Smith. And then all these 6 volumes of American history told the way it ought to be told. And finally, back to our friend Frank Davidson. Now, in this packet is a challenge to you all tonight to help me take this film, which was done by John O'Brien, the filmmaker, along with some help from me and Clint Gardner, who spent 2 days in Frank Davidson's house in Concord, Mass, to do the definitive oral history on Camp William James. So this is a project, and I know, Nick, you like things visual, so just by virtue of the fact that you're here tonight, you're sort of in the catchment now, and we're going to talk about this. Sort of like it, whether you like it or not. But I want to tell you about Frank Davidson. He was the guy that pulled the trigger with Eleanor Roosevelt. And Frank also went off to World War II in France. And when he was there, happily he survived. He met the love of his life. And she was well connected in French society. In fact, years later, when we were doing this taping in his house in Concord, one of his neighbors whispered to me, and she said, "You know, her family owns the North Sea." What she really meant to say was they own the oil under the North Sea. But nevertheless, she came back to America with Frank and spent the rest of her life there. They both lived well into their 90s. And this is what happened to Frank. When they left France, headed for England, they ran into a storm. And what should have been a 2.5-hour crossing of the English Channel turned out to be 9 hours. And his wife wasn't used to those kinds of inconveniences. Lovely lady, but this was over the top. And she said to him, "Frank, you've got to do something about this." So, being well connected, back in New York City, when he got back there, he went to the famous House of Morgan, equipped with one of his Harvard classmates and a popular science magazine. And he said, "What we're here for today is we're going to build a tunnel under the English Channel." And the people at the House of Morgan said, "We'll work with you on that." And so they did, and for 30 years he advocated for the English Channel tunnel. And for that, he was given a seat, even though he was a lawyer, a seat on the faculty at MIT. And he wrote the book called Macro, meaning macro engineering, right? When the ribbon was cut on the English Channel Tunnel, it was Frank who cut it. So a notable guy, and just, I don't know if you can tell by looking at him, but the most fun-loving guy ever. A very avid equestrian, had a horse right in the backyard of his house in Concord, Mass. And by the time that I got to know him one-on-one and we did all this taping, he invited Peggy and I back to a book signing in Harvard Square. The last work that he did was a 2-volume set of books called The Great Works, and it was on the great works of engineering around the world. And a woman from the Harvard faculty had collaborated with him, and this was their big night. And so he took us all out to dinner, and we listened to his talk and her talk, and it was pretty exciting. And afterwards, he gave me the 2 books and signed them over to me, a personal treasure. And I quickly leafed through them. I have a background in engineering myself, and I said, Frank, the pyramids are not in here. And this is really telling the whole story. He said, that's because we couldn't find the enabling legislation. And what he was talking about, it's all about language. Things don't get done unless people can communicate and communicate effectively. As an engineer, I can add 2 and 2 and get 4 every single time, forever. But if I can't communicate that effectively, all of that wizardry goes nowhere. Frank Davidson, really a special fellow. His moral equivalent of 4 is evident. And so for the last thing tonight, before we start asking questions, take note of the year Frank was born, 1917. Okay? He went to Harvard. Who do you suppose was in his class at Harvard? Sergeant Shriver and JFK. So when it came time for Sergeant Shriver and JFK to do something notable, they hashed it around to where they came up with reference to Camp William James to come up with their notion of an event they called the American Peace Corps. So as I've told countless Rhodes Scholar groups over the years, you drift into this one little one-horse town called White River Junction, and before you know it, you're talking about the English Channel Tunnel and the American Peace Corps. So thank you for listening.